So excited to be speaking to Professor Nils Melzer, who is the Human Rights Chair of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. He's also a professor of international law at the University of Glasgow, and he is the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And he's also the author of the excellent book, The Trial of Julian Assange. So welcome, Dr. Melzer.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. You write in your book about how you started out not very sympathetic to Julian Assange, and I thought it would be useful for you to walk people through your evolution on that, especially for people out there who may find themselves not being very sympathetic to Julian Assange. What changed your mind?
Well, to be honest with you, when his lawyers first contacted me in December 2018 and said that his living conditions at the Ecuadorian embassy had turned inhumane or a violation of the Anti-Torture Convention, I frankly just kind of, pushed this aside. And I had this emotional reaction thinking, oh, this is this hacker, this rapist, this, traitor. And I basically ignored the case. I remember distinctly that I had this emotional reaction, kind of negative prejudice against Assange. And so his lawyers came back about 3 months later, just before he was expelled from the embassy, and then they transmitted some evidence, some medical opinions to me and some other quite impressive evidence. And only when I actually looked at those facts, I started realizing that this doesn't add up with this whole public narrative that had been spread about him in the media for about 10 years. And I also realized that my negative emotions towards Assange, really, I didn't know where I had them from. I had never really dealt with his case before, but I was convinced that I knew everything about him. I was emotionally convinced. And that's what's so striking, because I realized that if I, as a human rights expert, I've been investigating human rights violations for 20 years. I've worked in war areas. I mean, I know some of the most terrible things people can do. And still, I basically was convinced that this narrative was true without actually knowing the facts behind the case. So as soon as I actually started looking into the case, scratching the surface and looking at the evidence, I started seeing that actually nothing of this added up. And this intrigued me. And I thought, I have to go and personally investigate this case because something's not right here. And so I went to see him once he was arrested in the British prison in Belmarsh, together with a medical team, specialists who were specialized in examining torture victims. And I started really digging into this case. And the deeper I got into this, the more dirt came out. But it was not on the side of Assange and WikiLeaks, it was on the side of the government. I myself have a government background. I used to be a security policy advisor of the Swiss government. I used to be a legal advisor of the International Committee on the Red Cross in war areas. I have a very conservative kind of international law background. And I couldn't believe how much corruption I encountered in this case. So what I want to say to people looking at this out here, if you think Assange is a traitor, he's a rapist, he's a narcissist, he's a hacker, I don't blame you, because you have been deceived. And if you think you've not been deceived, that's normal, because otherwise it wouldn't be deception, right? As soon as the deceived think they're being deceived, it's no longer deception. That's how it works. But I would encourage you to really look at those facts.
Can you talk about what major myths you think need to be debunked and what you found out that changed your mind?
I think a good starting point is asking ourselves, what is he actually being accused of? Being a rapist? Well, the Swedes themselves have dropped all allegations without, charging him. Not because there was a time limit, a statute of limitations, or because he was not available for their legal system. They dropped it when he was in British prison and available to them because they didn't have enough evidence to even press charges against him. So the rapist story we can discard. The other thing about being a traitor, well, how can you be a traitor to the US if you're an Australian citizen? He didn't publish his documents in the US. He didn't have a duty of non-disclosure towards the US. He wasn't employed by the US. He was an Australian journalist. There's no evidence whatsoever that he ever hacked information. He received information, just as any other journalist would, from whistleblowers. He had no obligations towards the US. And he received information that was of public interest. Let me remind you, it's information that proves war crimes, torture, all kinds of misconduct that's protected by the First Amendment in the US and by press freedom and human rights law. So That's what he's accused of if you look at the indictment, receiving and disclosing national security information that's classified. It's the first journalist in US history who's being indicted under the Espionage Act for simply publishing true information of public interest. So I ask myself, why are states spreading this type of narrative about him? And then, well, if you look at what he's done, then it starts adding up because, well, he published evidence for serious crimes by government officials. Now, normally, these government officials should be prosecuted. And we have clear evidence. I mean, it's not even disputed that this torture happened, that, you know, civilians were murdered, that journalists were murdered in collateral murder video and so on. Nobody has ever been prosecuted for that. And so that's really what this is about. That states are afraid of what WikiLeaks initiated. They created a mechanism by which whistleblowers can anonymously submit hundreds of thousands of pages of secret material through the internet. So that's different than, let's say, the Pentagon Papers in the 70s. Well, yes, that was a big leak, but that was pretty much the limit of what you could do at the time without the internet and so on. Today, with the internet, if WikiLeaks, the idea of WikiLeaks proliferates, and, you know, there's going to be 5,000 WikiLeaks, you know, 10 years from now, that's the end of the business model of governments conducting governance through secrecy. That's the end of impunity for war crimes and, you know, grave human rights violations and corruption. And I believe that's what this really is about. It's not about punishing Assange for any crime, because I'm still looking for what exactly is the crime they're accusing him of. I mean, so what's the crime? He's being threatened with 175 years in prison. What for exactly? You know, I mean, even the war criminals in The Hague did not get 175 years for genocide in Srebrenica in ex-Yugoslavia. You know, so, but here we have a publisher who has not hacked, had not stolen, has not, you know, used any violence, and then there's this narrative of he has harmed you know, national security by putting collaborators and US personnel in danger. Now, the US has been asked by the British judge, and by the way, also by the US judge in the Manning trial at the time in 2013, and now again in 2020 in London, to provide evidence for, you know, that anybody has been harmed or threatened, and the US has not been able to point to a single case of a person who has actually been harmed or threatened seriously by those publications. So again, is it theoretically possible that someone could have been put in danger? Perhaps, but it didn't happen. You don't threaten someone with 175 years in prison for that. So the purpose of this prosecution really is not to punish Assange for a real crime he has committed. It is to intimidate people like you, Katie, and other journalists, you know, investigative journalists who might perhaps, you know, if I give you a USB stick today with, you know, collateral murder number 2 and, you know, the next 250,000 diplomatic cables, would you publish them? Well, I guess it's a fair assumption that you would have a quick side look at what's happening to Assange for the past 10 years and then think about it. And that's exactly what I mean. That's what happened, and that's the purpose of this prosecution, or rather persecution, because it's the use of judicial institutions for political reasons, to set an example, you know, for everybody else to see. If you ever get the idea to do what Assange has done, this is what we'll do to you. And I think that's what this is really about.